Welcome back. This is Lecture 5 in the unit on the elements of music. Today we're going to be talking about music notation and also a little bit about melody. So notation is just the act of writing something down. If you are taking notes, you are notating. Right? And music, of course, doesn't have to be written down. A lot of popular music is never written down. The people who are performing it sometimes can't even read music, but it doesn't matter. They can still create music without necessarily being able to read or write music. But if music is written down, here's the system that has been used for the past several hundred years. It's not the only possible system. There were other systems in ancient cultures, but this is the system that has evolved and has spread throughout the world. First, let's talk about notating pitch, that is the highness or lowness, quote unquote, of sounds. They're not really high or low. They're higher in frequency or lower in frequency, but I know I've beaten that one to death. Okay, so in order to indicate the highness or lowness of sounds, and this is probably where this is one of the reasons why we just can't get that idea of high or low out of our heads, even though notes are not really high or low. When we write them down, they are higher or lower on the piece of paper. What we have here is a staff. There are 5 lines and 4 spaces in between. There's also a space on top, sitting on top of the staff, and a space below. And by looking at the lines and spaces, we see notes that are either right there lodged in the space or hanging on the line, with the line going directly through them. And that's how we know what note to play. But this staff, at the moment, doesn't have a clef. So we don't really know what any of those lines or spaces correspond to. In order to know that, we need a clef in there. The word clef is simply the French word for key. And it's a key not in the sense of like a piano key or a musical key. It's a key in the sense of like a map key. You're looking at a map and there's lots of symbols on there. You're not sure what they mean. You look over at the key and it tells you what the symbols mean. That's what a clef does in music. Here is the clef you are perhaps most familiar with. This is called treble clef. What it really is a G clef. This design is meant to focus your eye on the line that is going right through this sort of bullseye or this curly Q here. And whatever line it is that goes through that circle that this is drawing your eye into, that's going to be G. It's going to be the G above middle C, or G4 on the piano, the 4th highest G on the piano keyboard. Now, usually, almost always, the composer will write it so that that G is the 2nd line up. But these clefs are movable, and once in a while you see older music, maybe from 300 years ago, where this clef is raised so that one of these other lines is G. But these days, it's always going to be G as the 2nd line up. And if we know that G is the 2nd line up, then we know that A must be the space above it, and F must be the space below it, and the next line up must be B, etc. If we know G, we can figure out the rest. Now, in the early on in learning music, you might have to sort of count and figure it out and say, okay, if that's G, then that's A. But the idea is you become so quick at it after a while that you don't need to do that, and you can just recognize what note it is by what line or what space it's on. Now, you can look at this and you say, okay, so we have 5 lines and 4 spaces. That's 9 notes. We have the additional space sitting below the staff and above the staff. I guess that makes 11 notes. That's not very many notes. There's a lot more notes than that. Well, what we can do is we can have another staff, and this one is covering some lower notes. So this is a bass clef. It's also, really, it's an F clef, because what we have here is a design that is meant to draw your eye to this 2nd line down. So we've got this sort of knob here, and we've got this curve, and where the curve bulges out to its most extreme point is also where this line passes through. And we have these 2 dots. the line passes right through the two dots. Whichever line on the staff is going through those two dots and the fat part of the curve and over to this knob, that's going to be F. Again, these clefs are movable, but these days, this one is almost always going to be like this. I should say it's always going to be like this. If you look at an older piece of music, it might be moved, but in modern music notation, they've kind of settled on the idea that in bass clef, it's always the second line down that's going to be F. And again, it's not just any F, it's the F below middle C, what we would call F3 on the piano. Okay, so now we have an additional 5 lines and 4 spaces in between. And if I was playing piano music, for example, we would maybe bracket these two together, and my right hand would always play the upper staff, because on the piano, the higher notes are on the right hand, and my left hand would always play the lower staff. Now, I should say, if you're playing piano music, the right hand might not always be in treble clef. I could be playing with both my hands down in the lower part of the piano, and therefore maybe both my hands are in bass clef. Or I could be playing with both my hands in the upper register of the piano, and therefore I would have to read treble clef on both staffs. But 80% of the time, at least, maybe 90% of the time, if you're looking at a piece of piano music, the right-hand part is in treble clef, the left-hand part is in bass clef. And exactly in between them, exactly equidistant from both clefs, is middle C. Middle C has to be written on a ledger line. A ledger line is a little extra section of line that we use to extend the range of the clef. So we can have a ledger line up here as well. We could have multiple ledger lines. Right? But it just so happens that middle C is one ledger line down from treble clef and one ledger line up from bass clef. Notice, however, usually, well, always really, the staffs in a grand staff like this are going to be separated from each other so that middle C in treble clef appears higher, and I've written it a little bit higher here, than middle C in bass clef, but they are really the same note. We have to separate the clefs from each other, the staffs from each other, because if they were really as close as they musically are, that is, if we were to draw this to musical scale and keep the distances exactly consistent with the distances on the keyboard, then this ledger line would have to be exactly equidistant between the two staffs. But we generally don't do that because we want to keep these staffs distinct from each other. We want to maintain that rule of 5 that I talked about. It's hard for our brains to process more than 5 lines, right? So if we had another line exactly in between them, it makes it difficult for our brains to figure it out. Then it becomes like a big 11-line staff. So we separate the upper staff from the lower staff. If we were playing the organ, I mentioned about the organ in a previous lecture on the families of instruments. If you're playing music on the organ, you've got one staff for your right hand, one for your left hand, and one for your feet. Right? So greatly complicates things. If you're an orchestral conductor, you have to read all the different parts of the orchestral score simultaneously. Okay, so some other aspects of notating pitch. First of all, as we turn to the next page in your book, and here now I'm on page 36, they have a little picture of the layout of the piano keyboard. And I'm not going to, I don't have my own little hand drawing of that, but I think you're all familiar with what the piano keyboard looks like, and you can certainly reference the book. We have white keys and we have black keys, right? And the black keys are in this pattern of 2 and then 3 and then 2 and then 3. And you might wonder, well, why 2 and 3 and 2 and 3? Why not have a black key in between every white key? Well, if you did that, for one thing, it'd be impossible to tell which keys are which. If you had all white keys with all black keys in between them, it would be just impossible to distinguish any one key from any other. We need this pattern of 2 and 3. And that's not the only reason that it exists, but so every note on the piano can be determined by its relationship to the group of 2 and the group of 3. Right? So for example, the note C on the piano is the white key just to the left of the group of 2 black keys. The note D is the white key that is in between the 2 black keys, etc. Now, the white keys are all given names corresponding to letters of the alphabet, at least in the English language. It's not so in other languages, but in the English language, we call it, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Notice that the pattern starts over again every 7 letters. And they start from C. You might be wondering, why didn't they start from A? They could have started from A. If we start from A, it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and there is no H. It starts over again on A. So there are, we might put it this way, there are 7 white keys per octave. And it kind of makes sense because if we go one more than 7, then we get to the note that's an octave up, right? And that's what remember, an octave corresponds to a certain ratio of 2 to 1. But the reason we call it an octave is because if you proceed within a scale, or if you count white keys, if you start on C, or if you start on any of the white keys, and you just stay on the white keys and you count, when you get to 8, you're going to be at the white key that is an octave up. Right. How about the black keys? The black keys are all either something sharp or something flat. We have 2 different names for every black key. Right. The reasons for this are kind of complicated, but there is a logical reason for it. It has to do with the need to play in different keys, and also the tendency of notes to resolve one way or another. What I mean by that is, as you see on the page, if you're looking there at page 36, G sharp and A flat share the same key. It's the black key that's right in the middle of the group of 3. Well, why not just have one name for it? Well, G sharp is going to appear in certain keys and not in other keys. Same with A flat. And also, a G sharp is usually going to be followed by an A. It's going to move up. A melody that has a G sharp in it, I don't know, typically is going to move up to an A, whereas an A flat is going to be followed by a G. All right. So, without getting, I don't want to get into too much detail because it's not really within the scope of this class, but all of the black keys have 2 names, either something sharp relating to the white key that's below them, or something flat relating to the white key above them. So the black key immediately to the right of C is either C sharp or D flat. It depends on the context. By the way, it's possible to have white keys that are sharp as well. So for example, notice where we have E and F. There's no black key between E and F. Also between B and C, there is no black key between B and C. And remember, if we did have black keys in there, the keyboard would instantly become impossible to read because you'd have a black key between every white key and you would not know which key was which. However, there is such a thing as E sharp. It shares the same key with F. There's such a thing as F flat. It shares the same key with E. Similarly, there is such a thing as B sharp. It shares the same key as C. There's such a thing as C flat. It shares the same key as B. Why this is, it's kind of complicated. Don't really need to go into it much more than that, but there's a reason for it, and it is true. Okay, so knowing the names of those notes leads us into, and knowing that the black keys are always something sharp or something flat, leads us into a discussion of sharps, flats, and also naturals, and also key signatures. Okay, so A sharp or a flat is an indication that you are to play a note that is a half step above or a half step below what would normally be indicated on that line or that space. In other words, in most cases, not all, but most cases, it means don't play the white key, play the black key next to it, either immediately above it if it's a sharp or immediately below it if it's a flat. Now, I said in most cases because remember, there's no black key between B and C or between E and F. So there you would go to the white key, but you would still play the note that is next door, immediately next door, either above or below. And here is what a sharp looks like. Now, I'm going to show you some sharps in two different contexts. All right. The sharp looks kind of like a hashtag. We have this kind of crisscross pattern. It's not exactly like a tic-tac-toe, though, right? Because notice that the horizontal lines are not exactly horizontal. They go at an angle. And this makes it possible to read them, because imagine if they really were tic-tac-toe things, it would be difficult to read them against the horizontal lines of the staff. So we put them at an angle. This is one of these ingenious things about music notation. Everything is designed, even though it wasn't designed by any one person. It evolved over a long period of time, but it's been refined and designed to make it easy to read instantaneously, because you have to be able to read this stuff quickly and not second guess yourself for an instant, because music flows in time and we have to stay with the beat. We don't have time to think about stuff. It has to be automatic. And everything about music notation is geared towards making it easy to read. Anyway, so here's a sharp and here's another sharp. This one is telling you play F sharp, and this one is telling you play C sharp. And the context is, this is a key signature, and we might find it at the beginning of a piece of music. Like so here I've got the beginning of a piece of music, I've got my treble clef, and right off the bat the composer is telling me, don't play F. Whenever you see a note that appears on this line, don't play F sharp instead. And also, don't play C. If you see a note appearing in this space, don't play C, play C sharp instead. Right? Now, if the composer is telling me, basically, play all of the white keys except don't play F natural, play F sharp instead, don't play C sharp instead. What that's going to give me is the D major scale, or possibly the B minor scale. So the composer is telling me this piece is in the key of D major, or possibly in the key of B minor. There are two possibilities for every key signature. How do I know which key it is? Once you start playing the piece, it becomes obvious which key it is. And I'll point this out in an example a little bit later on. But for every key signature, there are two possible keys, one major and one minor. And the key signature is just the composer's way of telling you right at the beginning of the piece what key you're playing in. Okay, now over here, I've got another sharp, and this sharp is sitting in front of a G. And what this is telling me is, if I'm in the key of D major, G should normally be just a plain old G natural. There's no sharp on here in this key signature. But for whatever reason, as I'm playing the music, I come along to this note, which has a sharp in front of it. Right? This is called an accidental. An accidental is when you see a sharp or a flat or a natural, because there is such a thing as a natural sign. A natural cancels out a sharp or a flat. If I see a sharp or a flat or a natural that is indicating that I should play a note that is not commonly found in the key, then it's called an accidental. It's not an accidental thing, it's on purpose, but it's called an accidental. An accidental is a sharp or a flat or a natural note that is not found in the key. It's kind of like the composer's making an exception. He's saying, even though this is not a note that is found in the key of D major or B minor, I want you to play it anyway. Here we have something similar in bass clef. Here's my bass clef. This line must be F. And I've got 3 flats in this particular key signature. And what this is telling me, if I'm a well-trained musician, I can look at that and instantly realize, okay, I must be in the key of E flat major, which has 3 flats in it, or its corresponding relative minor key, C minor. I'm not going to need for you to know key signatures. I'm just demonstrating the principle here. Anyway, if I'm in the key of E flat major or C minor, and I'm playing this music, and eventually I get to this is an E natural, right? I've got a note in the space that corresponds to E, but E is supposed to be flat. The composer told me at the beginning that E is flat. Well, here he's telling you, I'm making an exception. I want you to play an E natural, the white key, instead of the lowered version, the E flat. Right? So we have key signatures over here, accidentals over here, right? These are sharps, these are flats. This one happens to be natural. We also have, by the way, such a thing as double flats and double sharps. I'm not going to get into that. That's probably unnecessary. Some more stuff about notating pitches. Now, I showed you the 2 by far most commonly used clefs, but there are another couple of clefs to talk about, or actually one additional clef which is movable, which composers actually do, even in the present day, use on 2 different lines commonly, and that is the C clef. So notice, again, the design here is meant to draw your eye right towards this middle line, which passes through the middle of this object, okay? The line which passes through here always corresponds to middle C. Now remember, in the other clefs that I showed, middle C was in between the 2 staffs, right? And if you're playing in treble clef, it was kind of a low note. If you're playing in bass clef, it's kind of a high note. The problem is there are some instruments and some voice ranges where C is kind of like in the middle of their range. And therefore, if you're writing music for one of these instruments, you might have to constantly be switching back and forth between treble and bass clef because neither one of them works very well. So instead, we have a middle C clef. So this note is middle C. Now this is called alto clef. The clef itself, you can see, is a little bit lower compared to this one, which means we have more notes in the upper range, whereas here, this is tenor clef, and this is moved up. So now middle C is this line. That means we have more notes below because this is for an instrument or a voice with a lower range. Typically, the only instruments that use these clefs a lot might be like, in the case of the alto clef, the viola, maybe the English horn. Over here, the bassoon is sometimes in tenor clef, sometimes in bass clef. So there are some instruments, those instruments that have a range which is not really convenient for either treble clef or bass clef. We have these movable C clefs, alto and tenor clef. Also, dealing with this problem of range. What if you want to play a super high note? Like here I am in treble clef, and I have this really high G. Well, I could just stack up a bunch of ledger lines, or I could write that G an octave down and simply indicate above it 8VA. And that 8VA, and maybe a little line, tells the performer, okay, play a G, not this G, but the G that is an octave up. So these two are actually the same G. Now, the range of the piano is actually even much, much higher than this. So this 8VA thing is normally used for even higher notes. It's just that to save space, I kind of did it this way. But these are the exact same note. Similarly, in bass clef, let's say we want to write a super low note, like this low A. Well, instead of writing all the ledger lines, which makes it a little bit more difficult to read, you got to count those lines, say, okay, that's E, that's C, that must be A. You could write it on the higher A and then say 8VA bassa. Play it an octave lower in the bass. Right? So we have some workarounds for super high and super low notes. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps up talking about pitch. Now let's talk about how rhythm is notated. So we have to notate, we have to write in not only how high and how low the notes are, but also when do the notes occur in time and how long do they last. Not just the notes, but also the silences, right? That's what rhythm is. It's the precise occurrence and duration in time of sounds and silences. All right, so I'm going to give you a simplified version, and this is also found at the top of page 37 in the book. All right. Now, there's more to it than this, but I'm giving you a simplified version to understand the principle of the thing. Let's say we are in quadruple meter, which has 4 beats in it. Right? And let's say we've decided that the beat, the duration of each beat, is going to be a quarter note. That means we would need 4 quarter notes worth of time to fill a measure. Let's say we wanted to have 1 note sustaining through that entire measure. That would be a whole note, and it would look like this. It's just like a squashed circle. And that squashed circle would appear either in a space, or depending on what pitch we want, or on the line, with the line going directly through the circle so that we can clearly tell at a glance which note the composer intends. Another way to think of this, by the way, think of this as like a whole dollar. You could have a whole dollar, or you could have 2 50-cent pieces, 2 half dollars, and they still add up to a whole dollar. Right? So here's a whole note. Here are 2 half notes. Added together, you could also fill a measure of 4/4 time of quadruple meter with 2 half notes. Notice they look just like the whole note, except there's a stem on them. So this note lasts for 2 beats, this note lasts for 2 beats, and in duration they are equal to 1 whole note. We extend that, and we've got 4 quarter notes, so like dollar, half dollar, quarter. The quarter notes look like half notes, except the circle is filled in. It's filled in black. Each one of these, now if we are in 4/4 time, what that means, that meter signature indicates that we have 4 quarter notes worth of time, and the quarter note represents the beat. Here we have eighth notes, right? And an eighth note lasts for half a beat, at least in 4/4 time. It has half the duration of the quarter note, which in turn has half the duration of the half note, which in turn has half the duration of the whole note. The only difference between the quarter note and the eighth note is the eighth note has either a stem like this, if it's off on its own. If it's an individual eighth note, it's going to have this flag, or if they are grouped together, as is commonly done to make them easier to read, we often beam them together with these beams, okay? This eighth note here is exactly the same as this eighth note. It's just that this one is tied to this other one, makes it easier to read. If we need to have an eighth note off by itself, not connected, not followed by another eighth note, we would put this flag on it. Another reason we might use an individual eighth note is if we are looking at a piece of vocal music where each eighth note lines up with a particular syllable in the text. The singer needs to know, okay, that eighth note is with this syllable and this eighth note is with that syllable, and so the composer will write them as individual eighth notes instead of beaming them together. But in instrumental music, if we have a long string of eighth notes, they're going to be beamed together. Same principle extended down to the 16th note, right? So each one of these 16th notes lasts for a quarter of a beat, and they have a double beam or a double flag if we're looking at an individual 16th note. This principle can continue on theoretically indefinitely. You can have 32nd notes that have a triple beam, 64th notes, right? 128th notes. You don't see that very often, but it's theoretically possible. You don't usually see anything beyond 32nd notes. It's pretty rare, right? This pretty much does the job for whatever a composer wants to do. You might wonder, though, what if we want a note that lasts for 3 beats or for 1.5 beats? What if we want a note that is some value other than 4 or 2 or 1 or 1/2 or 1/4? There are ways of doing that, which I will talk about in a second. First, though, I want to show you the same breakdown for rests as I've just shown you for notes. Because remember, every instance of time has to be accounted for. We can't just leave the music blank and assume that people will know to rest and to stay silent. We have to write in the silences, and we have to write in the precise amount of silence in combination with the amount of sound that we want, so that we have all of the time accounted for in a given measure. So here is a whole rest. It's basically just a black rectangle that is placed below a line in the staff. Here are 2 half rests. It's a black rectangle above the line. Here are some quarter rests. Here are some 1/8 rests. Here are some 16th rests. I didn't bother writing them all out. With rests, by the way, unlike notes, there's no way of reiterating a rest. For example, I could have 2 quarter notes in a row, la, la, right? I could have 2 of the same note or 2 different notes, but if I want, la, la, or la, la, if I want the same note repeated, I have to write it twice, even if it's on the same pitch. Don't need to do that with rests, right? There's really no need to ever have 2 quarter rests written in a row like this. You could just write a half rest. It's not like you're going to rest and rest again. It's just 2 beats worth of silence. But we need to have this whole system because we might have, for example, we might have a certain amount of notes, and then we need to fill in the rest of the time with rests, and it might be some odd combination. It might be, for example, it might be the case that we need 1.5 beats worth of rest at the end of a measure. So what we would do is we would write a quarter rest and then an 1/8 rest. Okay. This leads me to a discussion of how do we deal with time values other than 4 beats or 2 beats or 1 beat or 1/2 beat. 2 ways of dealing with this. First of all, we can use a dot. A dot adds 50% to the time value of a note or a rest. So if I have, let's say, a half note, and I add a dot to it, I say, well, 50% of 2, which is a half note, lasts for 2 beats. 50% of 2 is 1. So I'm adding 1 beat to the 2. The result is a note that lasts for 3 beats. We can do the same thing with, let's say, quarter notes. If you add a dot to a quarter note normally lasts for 1 beat. If I put a dot on there, now it lasts for 1.5 beats. An 1/8 note normally lasts for 1/2 beat. If I stick a dot on there, now it lasts for 3/4 of a beat. So by using dots, which add 50% to the value of notes, we can come up with finer gradations of duration and sound. Another thing we can do is we can use the tie. A tie is just a curved line that connects the note heads together, and we can add any 2 time values together in combination to come up with some irregular length. Now in this case, all I've done is I've tied a half note to a quarter note. So this is a note that lasts 3 beats. This is exactly the same as this. We have 2 different ways of indicating this particular duration, which is 3 beats. But using the tie, you can come up with pretty much any duration you want to. You could tie a half note to a 16th note and have a note which lasts for 2 1/4 beats, right? So this is how we do it. Using ties and dots, we can come up with very specific note values. Okay, I think I've covered pretty much everything having to do with notation, but I want to just show you a little example of how all of this can kind of come together. So I composed a short piece today just to demonstrate this purpose. Very short, only 2 measures long, because just couldn't fit more on this paper. So here is my composition, notated for you. It's in treble clef, so it's for a higher instrument. Could be for any, I don't know, could be for violin, trumpet, something like that. But notice, the first thing that I've indicated is the tempo. And the tempo that me, the composer, is calling for is allegro. And remember, allegro simply means cheerfully or fast, right? Specifically, it means about 2 beats per second. So the tempo here is going to be something like 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. That's about 2 beats per second, 120 beats per minute. Okay. So now I know my tempo. I know that I'm in treble clef. Here's my key signature, 2 sharps. So I'm either in D major or B minor. Which is it? We'll see once I start to play. Actually, I can give you a clue right off the bat. The first note is D, and the last note is D. So I'm probably in D major. Here's my time signature, 4/4 time. What this means is I'm in quadruple meter. There are 4 beats in every measure, and the quarter note shall represent the beat. In other words, each of the beats are a quarter note in duration. Okay, let's look at my notation and make sure that I actually have 4 quarter notes worth of time in every measure. Okay, so my first note is a quarter note. What do I have over here? I have a dotted 8th note that is beamed over to a 16th. Well, the dotted 8th contains, what, 3/4 of a beat worth of time, right? Because an 8th note normally is a half a beat. But if I add 50% to it, of its own value, now I've got 3/4 of a beat. The 16th note here contains 1/4 of a beat. So together, that's 1 beat. And that's why I've beamed them together. I want the performer to realize, glancing at this note on the fly, that this represents 1 beat's worth of time. Here's another quarter note. Here's another quarter note. So far, so good. I've got 4 quarter notes in this measure. Over here, this measure starts with a rest, a quarter rest, 1 beat in duration, and then a quarter note, and then a half note. So 1, 2, and then 2 more beats worth of time. I've got 4 beats in this measure as well. This little thing I decided to stick on there, that's called a fermata. And it's used in different ways in different contexts, but it's basically telling you you're at the end of a phrase. It also means to hold that note a little extra long. All right. Okay, let's hear what this thing sounds like. I'm in 4/4 time. Let me just get my tempo set again. Okay, it's like 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. Okay, ready? Here it is. What do you think? Oh, I should have held that last note longer because there's a fermata there. Let's try it again. There we go. By the way, there's one other thing here. Oh, no, we'll come to that when we talk about melody. But there's 2 different ways I could play this melody, actually. There's no indication of the articulation. What's articulation? It is whether I decide to connect the notes to each other or separate them. Now, if I wanted to connect these notes together, I might indicate that with what's called a slur or a phrase marking. All right, now that I've put that slur on there, really the way I should play it is like this. I'm playing them legato. Legato means connected. All right. So I'm trying to connect the notes to each other as much as possible. An alternative, though, might be if I were to cross out those slurs and instead put dots on the heads of the notes. I would be shortening the notes and separating them from each other, and it would sound like this. Now, the staccato over the half note is kind of a contradiction because if I shorten it that much, it's not really a half note anymore, and the fermata no longer makes sense. But for demonstration purposes, that's how we indicate if we want the notes to be short and spiky and separated from each other. In other words, staccato. So legato and staccato. These are different modes of articulation. Articulation is the whole issue of whether we connect notes together or we make them short and separated and spiky. Okay, and that leads us actually into a discussion of melody, because legato and staccato, these two words are actually brought up in the context of melody in the book, and they are different ways that you could articulate a melody. But first, of course, let's define what is a melody. The book's definition, it's pretty good, but I think it could use a little work. It says here on page 38, a melody is a series of single tones that add up to a recognizable whole. Well, yeah, but I think there's more to it than that. The thing about melody is, first of all, let's go back to the very first sentence. It says, for many of us, music means melody. And this is one of these instances in the book where, they have this kind of like, flowery talk. Yeah, maybe for many of us, music means melody, but as it turns out, you don't really need to have melody in order to have music. It's possible to have music without melody. Obviously, most music does, but I can think of several different types of music right off the top of my head that do not, like drum circle, right? There's no melody there, really. There's nothing you could sing in a drum circle. Rap doesn't really have melody. It might have little melodic snippets, but as I talk about melody, you'll see that really what rap has in place of melody is it has poetry. It has recited rhythmic declamation of words in place of melody. There are some composers decades ago, I don't know if anyone is doing this now, who in place of melody had this concept of like a sustained chord in an orchestra where the instruments would change gradually, the tone color would change, and in place of melody as being at the forefront of the listener's attention, you'd have changing tone colors, what they called it literally tone color melody. You could have music that is just kind of ambient, that is just sounds in the background, chords and sound effects or whatever, where there is nothing really like a melody in the forefront. So it's definitely possible to have music without melody, but most music that we listen to does. And what melody is, besides just a series of single tones that add up to a recognizable whole, in any music which has melody, the melody is front and center. It's the thing that the composer wants you to pay the most attention to. It's the main character. Whatever else may be going on, the melody is understood to be the most important thing, and anything else that might be appearing in conjunction with melody is kind of like background. It's what we might call accompaniment. Now, there's one exception to this, which I'm going to get to in a couple of seconds, because the next thing I'm going to talk about, having just defined melody, I'm not going to get into immediately into aspects of melody. I will, but first I want to talk about something called texture, which the book does bring up a little bit later, but I'm going to bring it up now, because texture has to do with the role of melody within a given piece of music. There are 3 different possible textures, and they're fairly easy to understand. The first is monophonic texture. Mono means one, right? And phonic means having to do with speaking or sound, right? Monophonic texture is when you have one melody and nothing else. So this masterpiece that I composed for you is in monophonic texture. There's just a melody and nothing else, right? If I played on the piano If we were to all sing it together, if I played it and someone else was playing it on the trumpet, and so, as long as we were all playing or singing the same melody, it would be monophonic texture. The next texture is homophonic texture. Homophonic texture is when we have melody plus some background stuff, which we would call accompaniment. And this is by far the most common texture in all popular music. Probably 99% of the music you've ever listened to in your life is in homophonic texture. So if I were to take my little melody and add some chords to sort of support the melody, give something else in the background, might be like now it's homophonic texture. Right? I might make that texture a little more interesting, like do something like I might put a little rhythmic pattern in the left hand so it's not just chords. There's lots of things I could do. But if I've got melody as the most important thing out front, and then other things in the background, that's homophonic texture. Now, who has the melody might change from one minute to the next. So like in a rock song, you might have the lead singer has the melody and the band is backing them up. And then there's a guitar solo. Well, at that moment, it's still homophonic texture. It's just that the guitarist has taken over the role of front and center melody. Right? The last texture, and the one you've probably heard the least, and yet one that is hugely important in music history, is polyphonic texture. Poly, as you can imagine, means many. Polyphonic texture is when we have several different melodies going on at the same time, two or more melodies going on simultaneously, and these melodies are understood to be of equal importance to each other. They are quasi-independent and equal. It's not like one of the melodies is like the main melody and the other melody is supposed to be some nice little background thing. They are really intended to be of equal importance. And for a very long time, for hundreds of years actually, back in the Renaissance, I would say late medieval, Renaissance, and in the Baroque era, and beyond for some composers, but that was the time when polyphonic texture was most prevalent. All serious composers considered polyphonic texture to be really the only one worth dealing with. It was a challenge for them, but it also represented like a more sophisticated, learned style of composition. And so we will be learning later about polyphonic texture, multiple melodies going on at the same time that are understood to be of more or less equal importance. Okay, so I've just dealt with texture, which has to do with the role of melody. Let's go back and talk about melody itself. And in doing so, we're going to bring back, remember, the concept of intervals. Intervals are the distances in pitch between pitches. And I used the example when I first talked about intervals a couple lectures ago, that it's sort of like intervals are to music sort of like what the lines in a connect the dot picture are to the picture. So the dots are like the notes, the lines are the intervals, and in many ways, those lines, those intervals, are more important than the dots because that's what gives the music meaning or recognizability or significance to you. Let's take this thing here. Right? I could play it with completely different notes. But the intervals, as long as the intervals remain the same, it's recognizable to you. This is what's called transposing. I'm taking the same melody and transposing it into a different key. As long as I keep the intervals consistent, it works. Now, you may also recall when I first started talking about intervals that there are two fundamental categories of intervals. Small intervals, which are called steps, and large intervals, which are called leaps. Right. For various reasons, leaps are considered more expressive than steps. And a lot of it has to do with the way we sing. Keep in mind, of course, the human voice is the original instrument. It's the instrument we carry around with us before we learn any other instrument. We are singing typically, right? And so composers very often write with the human voice in mind. Even if they aren't writing for the human voice, even if they're writing for piano, violin, or whatever, a good composer it just can't help but be conscious of the human voice, right? And the thing about steps and leaps, it's sort of like with, steps on a staircase, I think, with the example I used before. It's easier to sing the steps because they're notes that are right next to each other in a scale. More difficult to sing the leaps. And so there's sort of like struggle and yearning involved. And there's also some risk because you don't know if you're going to stick the landing, right? If you're going to be in tune when you land on that high note, or if you land on a low note, if it's a downward leap. So composers will kind of hold those leaps in reserve. Most melodies contain more steps than leaps. Not always, but usually. Another thing about melodies, they're very often broken up into phrases, right? In the same way that language is broken up into sentences. And just as language has sentences that end with punctuation marks, music, or melody, I should say, has phrases that end with cadences. The cadence is the musical equivalent of a punctuation mark. It's like a resting point. And very often, it's really there for the same reason as a punctuation mark. We need some place to breathe, especially if we're singing. Remember, we're thinking of the human voice. And we also might need to rest halfway through the phrase or the sentence. We might have a pause, like a comma. And our final punctuation mark might be of varying strength. It might be an exclamation point or a question mark or a period. We have the equivalents of this in music. We have many different types of cadences. And if you were in my music theory class, you'd have to learn all those different cadences, which ones are stronger and weaker. You don't need to do that for this class. You just have to know what a cadence is. It's the musical equivalent of a punctuation mark. It's sort of a melodic goal or a resting point. Some of them are stronger and more final. Some of them are weaker, shall we say, and suggest that there is more to come. Right? Most melodies, good melodies, or even individual phrases of melodies have some kind of a shape, and they will have some kind of what we call a peak or a climax that the melody builds to and then maybe builds down from. Usually the climax is the highest note, but it doesn't have to be. It could be the lowest note, it could be some other note. But composers are conscious of crafting a phrase or a melody which has a climax to it. Otherwise, it's just not satisfying somehow. What else do we have here? The book talks about legato and staccato, which I already talked about. Since we're running short on time, let's give a few examples of how these terms might be applied. So they have the example here of happy birthday. Perfect example. A lot to be learned, actually, from even something as simple as happy birthday in terms of how these practices are applied. So in the melody of happy birthday, there are 4 short phrases. Right? Here's the first phrase. Now, it's mostly steps. It's starting note, repeated, up a step, down a step. Here's a leap. It's a leap of a fourth, and then a step down. And then we have another phrase. The second phrase starts out exactly like the first, but it has a bigger leap. And so it feels like we're building up to something. Third phrase, the biggest leap of all. A leap of an octave, significant leap. And then we go down by some smaller leaps. And then we have our final phrase. So we have 4 phrases, 4 cadences. Some of these cadences are more definite, let's say stronger than others. So others are less definite, that don't sound like as much of a conclusion. And if I add some harmony in here, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. So phrase 1. Cadence 1. It's kind of a weak cadence. That is, we have an expectation that something has to follow. It's not a strong ending point. It's more like a comma. Second phrase. It's a strong cadence. We could almost end the piece right there, right? If you hadn't heard Happy Birthday, at least 18 or 19 times in your life, you might think, well, it could end right there. But no, there's more. Right? Again, this is the peak of our melody because we had that biggest leap, but the cadence at the end of this phrase is a weak cadence because we expect more to follow, right? And in fact, we do have something more to follow. Our final phrase, and again, a strong cadence to let us know we've come to the end. Notice the pattern we have in these four phrases. We have our opening phrase, repetition, but with some intensification, that is a larger leap, and then the climax in the third phrase, and then a resolution in the final phrase. So initial statement, repetition with some intensity, climax, followed by resolution. This is a very, very common pattern in a four-phrase grouping like this. Right? This is something that Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, all these composers did. And here we find it in something as simple as Happy Birthday. It's amazing. One other thing I want to mention in melody, one term, and that is the idea of the sequence. It's something you find very commonly in melodies. A sequence is simply a pattern of intervals or pitches, a melodic pattern, and also often a rhythmic pattern, a melodic/rhythmic pattern that is repeated at a higher or lower pitch level. I'll say it again, a sequence is a melodic/rhythmic pattern within a melody that is repeated at a higher or lower pitch level. There's an example I can think of that might be somewhat familiar to you, and that's from this Mozart sonata. So I'm going to play a little bit of a Mozart sonata. Hopefully it goes well. By the way, what texture are we in? Homophonic texture. Melody is in the right hand. The left hand has some accompaniment. It's really just kind of like outlining some chords and with a little bit of rhythmic interest, breaking up the chords into this eighth note pattern. Anyway, here we go. Here's my sequence. So if you notice, there's a scale that goes up and down, and each time it starts on a lower level. Notice how, now I'm not going to go on from there, but Mozart stops it after a while. If you continue with a sequence too long, it gets too predictable and boring. So after that, Mozart changes the pattern somewhat, etc. But we are running out of time, so I think I'm going to wrap up there. And I think I've covered everything we need to regarding melody. Oh, wait a minute. One last thing. I just turned the page, and I saw this picture of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. And this brings up the topic of melody and words. Okay, so if you are a composer and you are setting words to music, very often a clever composer will try and somehow illustrate the meaning of the words in the music. They will do things with the notes to try and maybe subconsciously reinforce the meaning of the words. And I think I've already pointed this out, and maybe in one of the previous lectures. I seem to remember playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow and pointing out that somewhere over the rainbow, when the melody makes that leap, it's almost unavoidable to think of so, especially if you slide a little bit, like somewhere over the. It almost makes a sort of a rainbow shape. Now, it's kind of interesting because it contradicts what I've said about music being in time and not in space. Remember, that octave, all it is, it's a 1 to 2 ratio. I mean, it's 2 to 1, but here's the 1 and here's the 2. We have a frequency, we have double the frequency. We have a little bit less than double the frequency. All we're hearing are frequencies that are greater or lesser, sometimes in some, precise mathematical proportion. But somehow our brains translate it into space. And this is just one of the many ways that composers can try and reinforce the meaning of the words musically, using things like high and low, right? There are many other examples. You should try and be on the lookout for them when you're listening to a piece of music. And even a piece of contemporary music, you will hear many instances, and they might be very subtle. You have to listen over and over again and realize, oh, wait a minute, he was at the moment when he sang that word, listen what he did and how it reinforced the meaning of the word. Composers did this intentionally for hundreds and hundreds of years, and sometimes I think they may even do it unconsciously. It just becomes a natural thing that they do, and they're not even aware of it, and it just turns out that way. Anyway, so I will leave off there. That technique is called word painting or text painting. The effort to try and depict somehow the meaning of the words using purely musical devices, and it's a feature we find in melody quite often. Okay, I've gone longer than I intended to. Next time we will talk about harmony. See you then.